Welcome to the 22nd Annual Research Workshop with the theme, Why Institutions Matter for Industrial-led Development.
We have been told that the theme for this workshop is Why Institutions Matter for Industrialization-led Development. This is indeed a timely and well-conceived theme that dovetails quite well with the country's second five-year development plan, which runs from 2016-17 to 2020-2021.
Strong institutions can provide the strong regulatory environment in which industrialization can begin, it can develop, grow, and flourish. The framework is there. Legally, we are fine. We have a good legal framework in Tanzania. That's not just my opinion, but that's what everybody feels and says. But we need our institutions to further develop, to come to their full potential.
There's obviously institutions that need to be strengthened when we talk about issues of development, but at the same time, there's some very strong institutions. There's institutions outside pure state institutions, for example, even things such as a national sense, a kind of like a sense of community, and the associated institutions there in Tanzania are quite strong. When you look at the closed order deals that provide order, one way you provide order is you provide predictability and stability into the politics, and having a party in which it reconciles the competing interests, so it's encompassing, and it has a long-term vision, is actually a very helpful mechanism to sort of move you into a deal space that can become an open deal space that can become a rule space. Whereas actually having a very conflictual politics makes it harder to generate predictable, legitimate deals that can of themselves get embodied in institutions.
What can the leadership do in order to facilitate industrial development that we have? The role of the leadership is to clarify policy, to put in place laws, rules, and regulations which will be friendly to business, and to make it actually throughout.
Small enterprises are the industries of Tanzania. Hao wako wengi kila mahali, lakini lazima we have to handle them with care, more care.
If we develop this generically high-quality institutions, those will produce broad-based success. My theory is if you focus on producing success, you will discover what you need that will eventually be embodied in institutions.
So if we look at who is making the rules, you've got, it's no longer international relations of your grandmother's time, right? It's not nation sovereign state to nation sovereign state. What you have is a whole proliferation of actors from multinational corporations, which are, as Lars said, incredibly powerful.
Industries will come as a result of development of agriculture.
Then you've got to know your local companies. If you want to have a successful negotiation, you've got to be realistic and knowledgeable. You've got to know what is feasible, what local companies could be brought up to speed to enter into the supply chain of this multinational. The opportunities are endless. They begin with construction. They go through retail services, general business services. They extend through to engineering services.
The traditional view of industrial policy is that certain sectors generate more learning, sort of dynamic learning externalities automatically, I would say. There's certain sectors are more inherently given to generating learning than others. Some of that learning, as I said, is external, so firms on their own are going to underinvest in it, and therefore the appropriate role of industrial policy is to subsidize those sectors or promote them in some way in order to increase the overall role of growth. That tends to lead to the policy implication that what governments need to do is just get a certain type of sector that's generating that learning. Get an auto sector, or get an electronic sector, or get a steel sector, and that will be sufficient in order to bring about growth.
The idea that you're going to push this generic civil service reform, that eventually that civil service reform will produce a higher quality service, and eventually a higher quality civil service will provide the mechanisms to promote higher, more rapid progress in diversified manufacturing export, I think is insane.
I mean, because each of those steps takes 20 years, whereas you want to say, let's focus on performance with the institutions we have. What can we do now, right, that both builds the institutions and delivers performance?
I don't think it's coincidence that the countries that have the strongest institutions in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, talking about Botswana, talking about Rwanda and Mauritius, are countries that actually have some form of local cultural practices, what otherwise would be informal institutions being formalized. They take into account the context. So I think the institutions that can lead to industrialization the most are institutions that take into account context.
And think a bit more in terms of the economics behind it, and the gains, vis-a-vis trying to just blanket it up without thinking downstream how these institutions or the industries can work better. Because we do not think through the whole value chain a little bit. We look at the instant, but not the futuristic sustainable paths we need to follow. So we need to communicate that more to the policymakers, and I hope they need to listen. And that's what we do. We're in the policy business. So communication and emphasizing it, policymakers, you will tell them, but of course they will do their own issue. But we should not get tired of informing them.
What's interesting for me is that there's not such a dramatic difference from what's happening in Kenya and the little I know about Uganda, which for me reinforces the need for more collaboration among scholars and among practitioners in the 3 East African community countries.
The economies are different in size. The Tanzanian economy is bigger than the Ugandan economy. But whatever we face, it is similar. Probably in the magnitude there's difference. But what we are facing both as Uganda and Tanzania, we are facing similar challenges. So the issue is how do we prioritize ours and how does Tanzania prioritize theirs? So, but the issue within the economies are pretty the same.
We could have benefited for including more groups. There's an issue also of gender representation, but there are other institutions that have a place here. For example, let's talk about labor. The syndicates have something to say when we talk about industrialization, because they are the workers. They are the ones that are there either learning or de-learning, but the workers are part of this process, and we didn't see much of labor discussion here. So this, I think we could have benefited more from this type of discussions, yeah.
My priority is Machinga. If we are going to industrialize, we have to look at the Machinga as well.
It's a problem, I think, in a poor country where resources are constrained. It's quite hard for the aspiring middle class who are concerned with their own development to think about others, and there's all kinds of issues with the taxation system, so you don't have a resource base to redistribute. So I think the bigger risks for the very poor and the excluded are the risks to access to land through changes in tenure regimes and that kind of thing. So there's a whole host of issues. But I think what needs to do is to consistently, as a researcher, ensure that those kinds of issues are on the table and ensure that we collect the right kind of evidence so that at least we can actually present a different picture of what's going on in the country.
This conference and conferences like this that are designed in an African perspective and trying to find topics that many countries are dealing with are very helpful, and this conference was very helpful in trying to see and analyze together how can we change the situation of our industrial sector from this institutional perspective.
I think we learned a lot, and as I said, the main thing is consultation between governments, private sector, governments, the universities, the international community. That is a main positive thing of this.
I think I'm correct to say that this workshop has been very successful, measured by the diversity of the stakeholders that has participated, the diversity of thoughts, and the participation of renowned scholars from many parts of the world, the participation of distinguished past and present leaders of this country. Has been a very key feature of success at this workshop.